I thought I was just fixing her car engine, but by the time the headlights dimmed, I realized she had quietly set something in motion inside me, something far more difficult to control. It was a little after 5 in the evening when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged me to pick up. On the other end, her voice came through, warm, smooth, with just the faintest edge of embarrassment. She explained that her car had broken down a few blocks from her house and that someone had mentioned I was good with engines. Her words were simple, but her tone carried a kind of careful confidence, the kind that belonged to someone used to handling life on her own. Still, I could hear the hesitation beneath it, the quiet admission that she needed help. By the time I arrived, the sky had softened into that honey-colored glow that comes right before sunset. Her car sat half in the driveway, hood propped open, and she leaned casually against the fender with her arms crossed. The look on her face was equal parts frustration and amusement, like she couldn't quite decide whether to scold the car or laugh at herself for getting stuck. She was in her early 40s, but it was the kind of age that carried itself with poise rather than weariness. The breeze shifted, and I caught the faint trace of her perfume, subtle and elegant, mixing with the sharper scent of engine oil hanging in the air. She straightened when she saw me, offering a smile that was polite but surprisingly warm. "I'm glad you came," she said, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "I was about 5 minutes from just giving up and calling a tow truck. But I thought I'd try the neighborly route first." I laughed softly, trying to hide the way her presence seemed to press unexpectedly at my chest. "Well, lucky for you. Engines usually talk to me if I listen close enough." That made her laugh, low and genuine, and I swear it lingered in the air longer than it should have. As I walked to the front of the car, I could feel her eyes following me. I lifted the hood higher, letting the shadows peel back from the maze of wires and metal. The engine still carried the faint heat of its earlier struggle. My hands found the familiar rhythm of checking connections, tracing problems, but my attention kept flicking back to the way she stood nearby. She didn't hover nervously the way some people do when they don't understand what's happening. Instead, she leaned lightly against the side mirror, watching with a kind of calm patience. Every so often, her gaze would drift toward me, and when our eyes met briefly, there was an unspoken question there, not just about whether the car would start, but about who I was and why I was really here. The sun sank lower, painting her profile in gold as I worked. She broke the silence after a while, her voice quiet but steady. "Funny how it takes a broken car to make me actually ask for help. I don't usually do this." Her words caught me off guard, though I pretended to stay focused on the engine. There was something in the way she said it, a hint of vulnerability wrapped carefully inside her self-assurance. And in that moment, with grease already staining my hands and the engine refusing to cooperate, I realized this was about more than just fixing a car. Something in her presence had shifted the air around us. Something told me this was only the beginning. The engine gave me a little trouble at first. A stubborn silence followed every turn of the key, and I could feel her eyes on me as I leaned deeper into the hood. I muttered something about spark plugs and wiring, mostly to fill the air, but she didn't seem to mind. Instead, she moved closer, her heels clicking softly against the driveway before the sound stopped right beside me. She crouched a little, resting one hand against the car as she peered into the maze of metal, like she might actually see what I was seeing. Her perfume carried faintly on the warm breeze, mixing with the sharper scent of gasoline. I tried to focus on the cables in my hands, but her nearness made every small sound, her breath, the rustle of her sleeve, stand out sharper than the click of my tools. "Does it look bad?" she asked, tilting her head toward me. I glanced sideways at her, only to find her closer than I expected, close enough that our shoulders almost brushed. For a second, I forgot the question. Her eyes were steady on mine, curious, not panicked. Confident, but with that quiet edge of trust that she had decided to place in me. "Not bad," I finally answered, clearing my throat. "Just stubborn. Some things don't like being rushed." The corner of her mouth curved upward at that, like she found meaning in words I hadn't intended to carry weight. She reached for the small flashlight I'd set on the ground and held it out to me, her fingers brushing against mine as I took it. The touch was fleeting, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have, threading up my arm with a quiet insistence. Her gaze drifted over my face, and before I could stop her, she laughed softly. "You've got," she gestured vaguely to her own cheek. I swiped at mine with the back of my hand, smearing grease even further. That made her laugh harder, not unkind, but light, like the sound of someone who hadn't had a reason to really laugh all day. The kind of laugh that shook the seriousness from her shoulders. I felt my own smile tug free despite myself. Guess I make a better mechanic than I do a mirror. She leaned back slightly, still smiling, but her eyes lingered on me longer than I expected. It wasn't the amused glance of a neighbor watching a favor unfold. It was more searching, like she was measuring the space between us and deciding whether to step closer or not. I bent over the engine again, partly because it needed my attention, partly because I wasn't sure what to do with the quiet electricity that seemed to hum between us. My hands moved on autopilot, tightening a clamp, checking a belt, but my thoughts stayed tangled around her presence. Her voice came again, quieter this time. "It's strange. I don't usually let people see me this flustered." I looked up, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The engine bay separated us physically, but it didn't feel like distance. Her eyes held mine, steady and unguarded, and in that unspoken exchange, I realized we'd already shifted past the small talk of a broken car. It was still just grease and metal beneath my hands, but it felt like something far more delicate was being tested between us. And it wasn't the kind of thing you could fix with a wrench. It took a little coaxing, a few more adjustments, and a careful turn of the wrench before I finally straightened up. My back ached slightly from leaning into the hood, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I'd done it. I gave her a small nod before slipping into the driver's seat. She hovered nearby, one arm resting across the open door as she watched me twist the key. For a breathless second, silence filled the air. Then, with a low, steady rumble, the engine came back to life. She clapped her hands once in delight, the sound sharp against the settling evening. "You did it," she said, her smile breaking wide. But she didn't move away, didn't immediately jump into the driver's seat to take control. Instead, she leaned against the frame, her body angled toward me as if she wasn't in a rush to reclaim what was hers. I shut the car off and stepped back out. It should run smoothly now. The wiring was loose, nothing major. "You make it sound simple," she replied, shaking her head. "I spent 2 hours staring at it and got nowhere. Then you show up, and 5 minutes later," she gestured at the car with a soft laugh. "It feels like magic." Her eyes held mine as she spoke, and it was the way she said it, not rushed, not distracted, that struck me. She wasn't just talking about the car. There was something deliberate in her gaze, as though she wanted me to know she had noticed the care I'd taken, the patience in the small details. The car hummed behind us, the soft vibration settling into the air like background music. But neither of us stepped back, neither of us made the natural move to end things there. Instead, she leaned lightly against the car door, folding her arms as though she was comfortable settling into this moment. "So," she began, her voice gentler now, "what do you actually do? Besides saving stranded women from broken-down engines?" Her question caught me slightly off guard, mostly because of the way she asked it, with genuine interest, as if the answer mattered. I found myself telling her about my work, the projects I'd been balancing, the things people usually dismissed when they thought I was too young to have much experience. She listened intently, nodding in places, her eyes never wandering. Every so often, she tilted her head, her hair falling across her cheek in the fading light, and I noticed that her smile wasn't just polite. It was thoughtful, warm, as though she was quietly taking me in piece by piece. When I finished, she leaned back slightly, exhaling like someone who had been holding more inside than they meant to. "Funny," she said after a pause. "I spend so much time trying to look like I've got everything together, and then a stranger fixes my car, and suddenly I'm standing here talking about life." The honesty in her voice disarmed me. For all her poise, there was a loneliness tucked between her words, the kind of solitude that comes from carrying everything on your own for too long. I wanted to say something that would matter, something that would let her know I understood. But instead, I just smiled softly and said, "Sometimes all it takes is the right spark to get things running again." Her eyes lingered on me then, the faint glow of dusk catching the edges of her expression. It felt like the car wasn't the only thing that had come back to life. And for the first time that evening, I wasn't sure either of us wanted this moment to end. After a moment of shared quiet, she tilted her head toward the driver's seat with that faintly mischievous expression that had started to unnerve me in the most enjoyable way. "How about a test drive?" she suggested, her tone casual but carrying a subtle challenge. "Just to make sure everything is really working." I hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. I had expected her to take the car and leave, maybe wave a polite thanks. Instead, she was offering me a small window of time together, a pause that promised something more than just mechanical success. "Sure," I said finally, forcing my voice to sound calm. My hands brushed the door handle as I slid into the passenger seat, careful not to show the subtle anticipation that made my chest tighten. The car rumbled gently as she started the engine again, and the first moments of driving were filled with easy silence. The road stretched out before us, quiet and lined with tall trees whose shadows swayed across the dashboard. Inside, the small space of the car made the world outside feel distant, almost removed, leaving only the two of us in a bubble of suspended evening light. She glanced at me occasionally, not just with the casual attention of someone watching a passenger, but with curiosity, measuring, evaluating, maybe even teasing. "Do you do this often?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing lightly against the gearshift as she shifted into second. "Ride around fixing engines, or are you just unusually patient?" I chuckled, trying to sound relaxed, but the warmth of her presence made it hard. "Mostly, people just call me when things go wrong. Patience isn't usually the issue, it's attention to detail." My eyes flicked toward her profile. There was a quiet intensity there, the kind that comes from someone used to reading people carefully, without revealing their own heart. The conversation naturally shifted then, deeper than the weather or the car. She mentioned her job, her life, the little disappointments that rarely made it past polite small talk. I found myself answering honestly, talking about my own ambitions, the moments I felt overlooked because of my age. The words flowed easily, carried along by the subtle trust forming between us. Every so often, our hands brushed against the center console, brief, accidental touches that lingered longer than they should. The warmth of her skin through the faint fabric of her sleeve made my pulse quicken, without either of us acknowledging it. When she laughed, a soft, quiet laugh at something I said about being engine-challenged in more areas of life than just machinery, the sound filled the car. It wasn't loud or performative, it was the kind of laugh that felt like it belonged to the space we were sharing, like it was quietly stitching together a small thread of connection. By the time we returned to her street, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in dusky purples and deep blues. She didn't rush to get out. Instead, she left the car and park, her eyes holding mine in a moment that didn't require words. It was clear now, this wasn't just about a test drive. Something unspoken had begun to shift between us, subtle and undeniable. The engine had started, yes, but it felt like something inside both of us had started, too, a ride that neither of us could predict, yet both of us were quietly willing to take. And I knew deep down that neither of us wanted to end this ride just yet. She didn't immediately drive back to her house. Instead, she took a quiet turn down a narrow road I hadn't noticed before, lined with tall pines and the faint glow of distant streetlights. "I like this spot," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone that made it clear she wasn't speaking about the road alone. Just quiet. I followed her gaze as we pulled into a small clearing, the car coming to rest beneath the sweep of a wide, open sky. Stars had begun to prick through the deepening night, scattered like tiny whispers of light above us. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the engine cooling and the rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. She switched off the car and leaned back against her seat, leaving the door open just a crack. The air outside drifted in, cool and scented faintly of pine and earth, brushing across my arms and catching at the edges of her hair. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was no need. The silence itself was comfortable, almost deliberate, a shared pause that carried more weight than words could. "I don't usually do this," she said finally, her voice low, reflective. "I mean, invite someone to drive out with me just to sit and watch the sky." Her fingers lightly traced the edge of the dashboard, almost idly, yet the movement had a kind of intimacy that pulled at me. I wanted to respond, wanted to say something that would make her pause and notice me, notice what I felt, but I stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch. There was an honesty here that didn't need embellishment, a quiet trust, fragile and unspoken. When she leaned slightly toward me, her hand resting near mine on the console, the air between us seemed to shift. The brush of her fingers was subtle, almost accidental, yet the warmth that lingered was undeniable. I could feel the steady rhythm of her pulse through the small distance, the warmth that contrasted with the cool night air. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, searching, measuring, as if she were weighing not just my presence, but the comfort and safety she felt with me. "You know," she whispered, "it's strange, being around someone younger, and yet feeling like they understand more than anyone I've known." The words hung between us, tender and vulnerable, like an invitation I wasn't sure I was prepared for. I wanted to close the space between us, wanted to let my hand rest over hers, but I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the fragile honesty she had just offered. We stayed there for what felt like hours, the night sky stretching endlessly above us. The occasional chirp of crickets, the distant hum of the town, even the fading scent of the cooling car combined to create a quiet cocoon, a space separate from the world and from expectations. As the stars flickered above, I realized how unusual this felt, not just the ride, not just the conversation, but the quiet intimacy of simply being near her without pretense, without rush. The air between us was charged, yes, but it was gentle, slow, deliberate. And in that silence, I understood something simple yet profound. The ride hadn't ended with the engine starting. It was only beginning, and we were both already on it, suspended between the ordinary and something quietly extraordinary. The night had deepened, folding the clearing into shadows and starlight. The car was quiet now, the engine cooled to a gentle hum that seemed almost respectful of the space we had created. I shifted slightly in my seat, aware of the subtle nearness of her presence. Her hand had remained close to mine on the console, not quite touching, yet the tension between our hands was palpable, a kind of electricity that made my chest tighten. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice low and steady, almost trembling with the weight of unspoken things. "You fixed more than my car tonight," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a directness that surprised me. I blinked, unsure how to respond. The words weren't about mechanics. They carried something far heavier, something neither of us had dared name yet. Her gaze softened as she continued, revealing the vulnerability she usually kept tucked behind her poise. I don't usually let people in like this. Not like this." Her confession hung in the air, delicate and fragile, like a thread stretched between us. The faint scent of pine drifted through the open windows, mingling with the warmth of the car's interior, and for a moment the world beyond the clearing seemed to disappear. Without thinking, I lifted my hand, letting it hover just above hers. The distance was small, but it carried a deliberate weight. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers relax toward mine, the smallest movement, a quiet surrender, a quiet trust. When our hands finally met, it was gentle, tentative, but it spoke volumes. Her skin was warm, soft, and steady beneath my touch, and I felt the subtle pulse of her heartbeat mirrored against my own. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of the realization that both of us had been holding back, and that the barrier between us was finally softening. I could feel the careful way she had been guarding herself, the way she had measured each laugh, each glance, each touch, and now, just slightly, she was letting me in. She shifted closer, not abruptly, but just enough that the warmth of her arm brushed mine. The faint scent of her perfume wrapped around me again, softer now, more intimate in the quiet night. Her eyes searched mine, looking for a reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere, that I wouldn't retreat when things became real. "I don't know why I feel like this," she whispered, a hint of vulnerability threading through her voice. "It's been a long time since someone made me feel seen." I gave a small, soft smile, letting my fingers tighten gently around hers. "You've been seen tonight," I said. "And not just by me, but by someone who cares about the little things and the big ones too." For the first time, she leaned just slightly, her cheek brushing against the edge of my shoulder. It wasn't a rush, it wasn't a declaration, it was a quiet, lingering acknowledgement of something deeper, something neither of us had expected when the day began. The night held us there, in that delicate balance between hesitation and surrender. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, I realized that the ride she had mentioned earlier, the one that had just begun, was no longer about the car. It was about us. And I was willing to let it continue. We finally stirred from the quiet of the clearing, reluctantly turning the car back toward the familiar streets. The night had grown deeper, velvet dark except for the distant glow of streetlights that flickered like tiny beacons guiding us back to reality. Neither of us spoke at first. The hum of the engine filled the silence, steady and calm, yet charged with the unspoken tension that had been building all evening. As she drove, I caught her in the corner of my eye. The way she held the wheel was careful, deliberate, but her posture relaxed ever so slightly compared to when I first arrived. The faint glow of the dashboard lights reflected across her features, softening every line, revealing both her confidence and the quiet vulnerability she'd let me glimpse. I wanted to reach over, to take her hand, to bridge the small space between us. But instead, I let my fingers brush against the console, a subtle, shared acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between us. It was a language all its own, silent, deliberate, and intimate. Finally, she glanced at me, a playful sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there when we first met. "You fixed the car," she said softly, letting the words linger between us, "but I think our ride is just starting." There was no teasing in her voice, only a warmth that wrapped itself around me, a promise wrapped in a gentle smile. My chest tightened at her words, not from surprise, but from the realization that the unspoken feelings I'd been holding all evening were reflected perfectly in her own. When we pulled up outside her house, neither of us was in a rush to end the evening. The car engine hummed to a stop, and yet it felt like a heartbeat suspended in time, a pause, a breath that neither of us wanted to break. She turned toward me, and I could see the quiet question in her eyes. What now? The night had stretched, intimate and fragile, creating a space where honesty could breathe, where vulnerability didn't feel dangerous. Without a word, I reached over and let my hand find hers, the warmth of her skin grounding me, affirming everything that had passed between us. Her fingers curled gently around mine, and for a moment, nothing else existed, not the streetlights, not the night, not the world outside. Just the two of us, connected by more than proximity, more than circumstance. She leaned in slightly, a subtle movement that spoke of trust and curiosity, and I felt the quiet thrum of possibility in that small, unassuming gesture. "I guess this is where it starts," I said, voice low, almost a whisper, letting the words carry all the meaning I couldn't quite say outright. Her smile widened, soft and knowing, and she pressed her hand to mine once more. "I think it already has," she replied, eyes glinting with a mixture of playfulness and sincerity. I lingered for a heartbeat longer, letting the moment stretch, savoring the gentle gravity of it. Then, finally, I leaned in just slightly, not for a kiss, not for a declaration, but for a quiet embrace, a grounding, steadying acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between us. The night air wrapped around us, the faint hum of the cooling engine outside, the distant stars watching silently. And in that embrace, I knew the ride wasn't over. It had only just begun, and for the first time, I felt ready to see where it would take us. And as she pulled the car door closed and we finally stepped out into the calm night together, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, fixing a stubborn engine, sharing a quiet conversation, a fleeting touch, could start a journey far larger than either of us had expected. The ride had started. and neither of us would forget it. 30.